Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the IBIA webinar, The State of Mobile Identity Credentials. I am Tova Ladir, the Executive Director of IBIA, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this event. With the participation of industry leaders and US and Canadian associations leading the efforts to the adoption of mobile driver's licenses and digital travel credentials, the webinar will address the path to digital identity. It will focus on the key necessary factors that are essential for a successful transition from physical credentials to digital credentials. Interest in mobile credentials is not new, and efforts to make them a reality have been ongoing for years. As our speakers will make clear, a confluence of numerous factors has now accelerated the path to digital identity. Our moderator today is Chris Burt, editor of biometricupdate.com, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce him. Chris's work covers all applications and issues in the biometric sector, including national security, mobile identity, and border control. He is especially interested in the UN Sustainable Development Goal 16.9 to provide universal digital identification in and the ID4A Africa movement. Chris will take over from here and will introduce the speakers and field questions through the chat room. Again, everybody, welcome to the event.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Tova. Thank you all for joining us today. We have a timely topic today, and as Tova just mentioned, a really exciting panel of experts from all across the digital identity ecosystem who have played important roles in bringing us to this point. So to introduce the topic a little more, driver's licenses and passports, as we all know, are among the most important documents that a person can own. They allow us not only to drive cars and visit faraway places, but also to prove who we are in a variety of contexts that often seem to have nothing to do with the original uses for these valuable credentials. They also have limitations, however. Those limitations can cause us inconvenience and pointless effort. They can prevent the documents from being used in situations where they could be helpful, and they can even put our personal data and security at risk. Digital versions of driver's licenses and travel credentials may enable people to move beyond these limitations and use their government-issued identity documents in a more empowered way, while also enabling the kinds of touch-free interactions that have become a normal part of society these days. Every day, thousands of people around the world are denied entry into a facility, or denied an age-restricted purchase or another service because they've forgotten their ID. But most of the time, I bet those people have their mobile phones on them. So if you can pay with your phone, why can't it prove you're 21? Well, it can, and soon will. Handing your ID over to a complete stranger also made many people uncomfortable long before the physical exchange of documents became considered a health hazard. The person working the door at an event or club may be qualified to do the job, but do you really want that person to know your home address? A survey of 4,000 Americans back in 2017 found that 80% were interested in having a mobile driver's license. And a survey of IT leaders at airlines and airports a year ago showed that over half were already convinced that enabling the use of a biometric token is one of the most beneficial technologies they could put in place for passengers. Both of those numbers have surely only increased now that people are trying to avoid touching shared surfaces or exchanging items like physical driver's licenses and passports. Back in 2016, Acuity forecast that physical credentials backed by biometrics will peak at $1 billion a year by 2022, and then be replaced by digital credentials. Good Intelligence forecast last year that more than 3 billion digital identities will be issued by 2025, with mobile driver's licenses and digital travel identities among the main forms that they will take. So that's less than 5 years. The potential of these digital credentials to help people also comes with a range of potential challenges and risks. So getting it right is important. Fortunately, efforts at figuring out how to make digital credentials easy to use, useful, secure, and inclusive are much further along than most people are aware. The Real ID security standard for physical credentials in the US was set back in 2005, but only reached all 50 states across the nation within the past year. That step was likely a prerequisite for the next step, which is digitization. Digital identity credentials for travel were already a hot topic before the pandemic and have reached advanced pilot stages. Particularly prominent projects are the International Air Transport Association, or IATA's, One ID, and the Known Traveler Digital Identity, which we will be hearing more about shortly. Initiatives to establish standards have progressed both in the United States and internationally, with bodies like ISO and the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, publishing standards and working towards releasing others. The IBIA published its white paper on principles for the implementation and use of biometrically enabled mobile identity credentials, which outlines 5 core principles, earlier this year. The principles are that digital credentials will assert the same identity and requisite privileges as physical credentials from which they are derived. They will adhere to internationally accepted standards and definitions. The use of biometrics is foundational to any identity credential, whether physical or digital. That self-service processes require robust document authentication processes to establish the authenticity of the source document, and that facial recognition matching processes are inherently critical to the success of digital credential programs. We may now be approaching the tipping point for mobile driver's licenses and digital credentials. Action has certainly picked up. Pilots have been carried out in a number of states and are being planned in others. Oklahoma and Colorado launched mobile ID apps last year. The TSA issued a request for information for a digital alternative to physical travel credentials just in August. Elsewhere, countries around the world, including Australia, South Korea, Turkey, and Pakistan, have launched mobile driver's licenses already. Joining me today to discuss when you'll be able to get your mobile digital ID, how great it will be, and what work remains to be done between now and then is a panel of distinguished experts from different stakeholder groups across the digital mobile credential ecosystem. A little later on, we'll be hearing from Mindy Stevens, Manager of Identity Management for the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, or the AAMVA. Mindy has been involved in the efforts to advance digital driver's licenses or mobile driver's licenses in the US. We will also hear from Justin Yakura, Vice Chair of ICAO's New Technologies Working Group, and he is also the Deputy Director of the International Unit of the Canadian Passport Program, so an expert in travel credentials. We'll be hearing from Jean-Baptiste Mien, Mobile ID Product Director for GoID Citizen ID Solutions at HID Global, and from Paul Townsend, Certified Information Systems Security Professional and Head of Government Systems for Accurate. They are each among the authors of the IBIA white paper and will be explaining it to us starting now. So I would like to, at this point, turn the discussion over to Jean-Baptiste.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar. Like Chris said, I'm the product director for the mobile identities at HID Global, and I'm especially taking care of GoID, which is our flagship solution, but I'm also the chair of the mobility working group at IBIA. This working group has been created in 2018, and its primary intent is to pave the way for the use of biometrics for mobile identities, to guide the authorities and the industry. As chair, my first role has been to build a team. And today, after 2 years of activity, I'm proud to say that the team is made of highly skilled individuals from leading companies in our sector. HID Global, Accurant, Innovatrix, and Aware, to just mention some of them. The mobility working group is open to new participants if you feel that you can bring some value to the group. Our first activity as a working group has been to write and publish a white paper. The intent of this white paper is to highlight the good practice, to break some myths, and to show the way for an optimized implementation with the right balance between security and usability. The mobility working group decided to work on this white paper now because we observe a unique momentum. On one side, we see market readiness. The three stakeholders of mobile identity, which are the issuing authorities, the identity holders, and the verification entities, also called the relying parties, show readiness. The standardization is also reaching maturity. We see that for mobile driving license, and we see that for mobile passport, called DTC. The technology itself is also reaching the right level of usability with the right level of security. The white paper has been published in March of this year and is available since then for download on the website of IBIA, and I encourage you to get there and to download the paper. The authors of that paper are written on this page, but we get Paul Townsend from Accurant, who will drive you through the white paper today, Bill Dumont from Innovatrix, that I would like to thank for his contribution, as well as Magruder Dan from Aware, myself, and of course, all of this would not have been possible without the support and the guidance of Tova Ladir from IBIA. I'll pass to Paul now.
Thank you, JB. I appreciate the intro, and thank you all for attending and giving us the opportunity to discuss this great topic with you guys as digital credentials are coming into play around the globe. Some of the core principles behind the paper, we're looking at why is this important? What do you need to consider when you are building a digital identity program? And how can that be facilitated by the state of the art today in technology? The key principle, though, is that the digital credentials must assert the same identity and privileges as the credential from which they are derived. Without that, it's just another substitute for a piece of plastic, and that's not necessarily a good thing. The key to that is that the standards are there. They've been developed. They're growing to address interoperability and a trust framework that make these credentials realistic for their deployment and use. BIA is involved simply because a good digital credential also includes a strong biometric that becomes the foundation for that credential as you are developing capabilities and frameworks around the use of that biometric. When you're looking at deployment, you want to look at things like how are you actually establishing the trust anchor that becomes the basis for associating different attributes with a particular identity credential, attributes such as the biometrics. And really, do you have a good foundation for the establishment of that identity, either through looking things up in a database that's trusted, or by doing strong and very thorough document authentication to ensure that the document that you are replacing is actually authentic before you actually augment its abilities through the production of a digital credential. And certainly the facial recognition matching processes that will be used in authenticating the individual to that document are very critical to the success of the program. So why a digital credential? What are some of the advantages? Well, as I mentioned before, data integrity, interoperability, standards for communication have been defined and are being enhanced as the programs are rolling out. So you've got the ability to make sure that once that credential has been issued, it can't be tampered with. It can be trusted wherever it's being used, it is interoperable across different frameworks, and you have ways to share that credential to support those various use cases that you're trying to support, whether that's logging onto a website, checking in for a flight, crossing a border, proving a driving privilege. All of those things are important use cases that will be able to be supported with digital identities. But you also want to take advantage of the risk mitigation processes that are inherent in the use of digital credentials, as well as the ability to build in consent and privacy by design in these programs, so that everything moves forward easily, readily, and is well trusted. So what do you need to consider? Certainly, you need to be able to authenticate the digital credential with the same veracity as you do of the physical credential, right? So when you are doing the document authentication piece, whether that's for a driver's license or a physical passport book, you want to be able to perform strong authentication. You want to make sure that that document is actually real. There are, in the case of driver's licenses and other plastics-based credentials, there are certain security features that have been put in place to make sure that that can be assessed as an authentic document. With passports, there are cryptographic processes that for the biometric passports that are now running around the globe, and making sure that you, as the traveler, can authenticate yourself as you're crossing borders. So those same types of mechanisms need to be in place for the use of a digital credential at whatever relying party application that you're using that with. So you want to also look at what's your enrollment mechanism? What's the way that you are actually proving the identity prior to issuing the digital identity? There are different considerations if you're doing things in person versus through a remote self-service application. In person, you have the ability to check them directly against a database through a gallery of different biometrics that have been previously captured to dedupe those and make sure you're actually talking to the right person. With remote self-service, you need to make sure that you're actually talking to a live person or enrolling a live person, as opposed to someone that found a credential and they're trying to authenticate against that and assume that identity. So again, strong data protections, privacy controls, those are defined in some of the standards that are coming forward for both mobile driver's license and digital travel credential programs. And they're merging together so that some of these same protections, the same controls are being built into the platforms and the frameworks that'll be used. So it's how do you actually access that information in those frameworks when the identity is being used or the credential is being used. Some of the things you want to take a look at is what's that life cycle look like? Again, remote vetting is important. Strong vetting is important, but you have to establish the trust anchor thoroughly. You have to make sure this is a real person, that whether you're basing that on a lookup of different attributes in a database, say looking at their credit histories, their addresses, their social security numbers, the phone numbers, the devices that they're authenticating with, or you're looking at the protections that are already established by the issuer of the credential, the physical credential, to make sure that it is authentic, it hasn't been tampered with, and everything is still intact since its issuance. Then you want to bind that person to that identity. Typically, the easiest way to do that is through facial recognition matching against what is on the physical credential. And then you have to figure out, how is that digital credential actually getting to the individual? Are you enrolling the person in a DMV and then making that available to be shared with the individual through a remote process where they're bringing it down to their phone and assuring that it's going to the right phone and things of that nature? With a digital travel credential, are you issuing it directly from the issuer to the individual, or are you letting them derive that themselves? Things to consider in the enrollment and issuance process. When you are capturing the biometrics and you're doing the authentication of the individual to the credential, you want to make sure that's as frictionless a process as possible. So you need to automate as much of that as is possible so that there is no interaction from my grandfather to his with his cell phone to his driver's license, that he doesn't have to press any buttons. It just automatically captures images of the document, automatically takes a selfie, does the liveness check at the same time, and makes that as easy for the individual to get through as possible, so that they're not fumbling around and they can easily engage the process and not drop out of the enrollment or registration process of what they're trying to use that credential for. Again, it needs to be a well-founded process to prove the identity assurance at the time of use. And so you're going through the cryptographic processes, you're going through the physical security assessments, again, with as little interaction from the individual as possible. When you're rolling this out, the next step is understanding where those biometrics are going to be stored, how they're being captured, what kind of quality controls are in place. Is the picture that's captured one that is able to be used for facial recognition matching, or is the quality of the webcam possibly not good enough to do the authentication of the document, right? Maybe there's some microtext in there as a security feature. Maybe there's some holograms that need to be reviewed. Those types of things where you really need a good image quality. How are you going to protect the data? Is it, are you storing the raw image of the biometric, whether that's a facial image or a fingerprint or some other biometric? How is it being protected? Is it being stored as a template or as minutia, or is it actually, is the raw image there? What access control mechanisms are in place to make sure that only the person that's authorized to obtain that biometric out of the container, out of the digital credential, can access that and use it? And really, how are we enforcing the privacy? How are we enforcing the consent of the individual whose credential that is to release it to the relying party? These are all considerations that you have to think about when you're delivering these types of programs. And the last thing is, how are those biometrics shared beyond the entry point into the orchestration layer that is accepting and using that as a relying party, right? Is it all self-contained? Is it distributed? Are you doing all the vetting, say, on your portal or your website, or are you introducing that credential into a broader continuum, such as a travel continuum, where you authenticate that credential coming in, and then you use the biometrics throughout the remainder of that continuum, where you're going through check-in, and then to bag drop, and then duty-free possibly, to getting onto the plane, to possibly crossing the border at the other end and checking into a hotel or renting a car. All of those being done simply with a credential that's been pre-presented and authenticated at every one of those places, so that when you show up to that point, you're simply doing a facial recognition match against what has already been proven to be an authentic credential. So that trust framework is absolutely critical to the mechanisms and the processing that's going on throughout that continuum. Is there a reason to use a digital credential versus a physical credential? Well, there's two key ones, right? The first is the data can be protected. The privacy data can be much better protected in a digital credential than it can be in a physical credential. As soon as I have control of the physical credential, I have all your private information. It's been released, right? With a digital credential, you can selectively release what you need to perform the particular transaction that you're trying to do, whether that's a regulated transaction, such as purchasing alcohol, or if an officer pulls you over and they just want to know that you have the privilege to drive in that state and your license hasn't been revoked or suspended. You know, those are things that you can control. and you can assert without handing over that piece of plastic and having it lost or what have you. And the authentication is much stronger for a digital credential because cryptographic processes that ensure that the document's authentic or the credential's authentic and it hasn't been tampered with or modified since it was issued. Those are real, those are in play, those are cryptographically protected and can be used to support any type of transaction, whether that's opening a bank account, establishing a line of credit, what have you, or simply driving and traveling. So the conclusion to all of this and from the paper is that the frameworks exist, the technologies exist, they're being deployed. They provide, these principles that I just covered provide a very sound basis for the implementation of biometrics in these digital credentials and their use in a very protected manner. And the proper implementation, it says design here, but the proper implementation is what's key to ensuring that you can trust the credential, the data is intact, there's privacy throughout the life cycle, and that digital credential can assert and prove the authenticity of the document and the privileges that are associated with that document for the individual that's presenting it. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you, Jean-Baptiste. As we can see, there's really been a lot of work that's gone into this, creating these frameworks, bringing them all together. So there's a lot of thought that's gone into how to preserve trust throughout the process. But one thing I just wanted to quickly ask before we continue is, Paul, you were mentioning the importance of facial recognition, but also referred to fingerprints being, embedded in a lot of these credentials. And as we were preparing for this, Jean-Baptiste and I were talking a little bit over email about the need for or how much capacity users have to have in terms of the technical capacity of their smartphone or their mobile phone, their skill level, which Paul, you also referred to. We want it to be easy, but there are different caliber or quality of cameras and so on. Facial recognition has been chosen over a different modality like fingerprints. So Jean-Baptiste, let's start with you. Can you talk about the user experience vision for these mobile credentials?
Yeah, Chris, thank you very much. Yeah, this is indeed one of the main topic here. Paul has driven us through the white paper, and as you can see, we have put a lot of effort into it, and there are a lot of details, but it has to remain simple enough for people to really adopt it and to use it. And the vision that we have, let's say we take one of the most usual process that we will see on the field, that will be the remote application process, right? Because most of the issuing authorities, they don't want to get additional people to come into their building. What they want is people to be able to do it from their home. And that's really a very simple three-step process that we will be observing and that we are recommending. When you go through the paper, you see a lot of detail, but it can come back to this is, it all starts by the requester being able to make an application from his mobile device, but it doesn't have to be an expert to do it. It has to remain simple. And it goes with just three stuff that we need them to do. The first is to be able to provide a reference of their record. That reference could just be an information that they have, or it can be just scanning a document, but it can just be as well providing a reference. Then they need to take a selfie with a proof of liveness. And again, there are capacities currently for the technology to be very easy to use by any individual. And of course, this is the basis, but then on top of that, there might be additional level of assurance that are requested by this issuing authority to request for additional information. But the basis would be there. Give me a reference to your record and take a selfie with a proof of liveness. Then we can enter the second step of the process, is that the authority itself has enough information to make a biometric evaluation. Transfer securely the information from the mobile device to the issuing authority system, retrieve the corresponding record, and then make a match between the two with a mechanism of adjudication. Is that person we claim to be? Is that person authorized to have one mobile identity? Is that mobile device approved to host a mobile identity? And then that's done. This adjudication is recorded. The next step will just be the issuing authority that is provisioning the mobile identity to the right device. They prepare the data according to the standard. They use a mechanism to send that mobile identity from their backend into the device. And then that's it. The user can already use their information. So if you look at the user experience, provide a reference, take a selfie, click on send, then there will be plenty of mechanism in the backend that is not altering the experience of the user. And then when it's ready, it will be on their phone and they can use it.
Great, thank you, JP. Yeah, that makes good sense. And so, Paul, if I could just briefly throw it over to you for a second, is it fair to summarize all that JB just described as, the process moving towards a simple step-by-step process on the front end, and all of these complex processes and concepts that the trust frameworks and the importance of how data is processed and everything, all of that is sort of being moved to the back end so that it's just out of scope for the user. Is that sort of a fair way to characterize it?
Well, that's perfectly fair, yes. And that is actually the way that things are being architected today, so that you have as little being done on the device as necessary to complete the process, where you are doing the automated capture, refining for glare and sharpness and things like that, sending the images to a back-end process to then process as many of the different services as are available or needed. So whether that's facial rec, liveness, doc authentication, passive authentication of passports, these types of things, all of that happens on a back-end server. You don't have to worry about the processing power on the phone. The phone just needs to take a nice crisp image and be able to talk to the possibly the chip on a passport. But everything else is done on the back end. And the workflows are typically architected so that when you're involving that phone, you're capturing metrics about the phone to make sure it is not being compromised either, that there's nothing being introduced outside of the workflow that you're controlling, and you've got a cryptographic path of, I got the information, these artifacts from this individual that they typed in, I checked these on these databases, I got this image from this phone at this time, and all of that's been authenticated. It's all within the right geolocation as the IP address that that phone is emanating, and all of these types of things. And I have the answer whether that's a good credential or not, or was able to generate a good credential based on a good credential or a good authentication of that identity. And you've got that all bound together. So yeah, all that is happening on the back end today.
Sounds a little easier than me and the photographer at the local place trying to decide if that picture is good enough for my passport or not. So exactly. I'll look forward to that. Great. At this point, I would like to move along and call on Mindy Stevens to tell us a little bit more about the AAMVA's efforts towards enabling mobile driver's licenses.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mindy Stevens, the manager of identity management from AMVA, shared previously by Chris. I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about mobile driver license. Won't go into a lot of details, and we'll cover some of what colleagues have already covered on the call, but definitely important stuff to hear. Next slide, please. Today, for the part I'll be sharing with you, we'll give a brief overview of mobile driver license to include basic understanding of what it is and what it's not, where it's going to be used, and the functional requirements that went into the standardization for the solution. And then we'll go into talking about some of the benefits of mobile driver license. Next slide. So what is a mobile driver license? Mobile driver license is basically just the driver license data from your physical card that's provisioned to a mobile device, whether that's a smartphone or a tablet, something along those lines. The information is stored in a secure container on the device and can be updated real time. There's also the capacity for users to have selective information release and control the amount of data that they're sharing. So in essence, that's basically what mobile driver license solution is. Next slide, please. What a mobile driver license is not. So there's some common misconceptions about a mobile driver license, one of which is that it's just a picture of your physical card on the phone. This is in fact not the case. As I explained on the slide just before, it's an interactive transmission of data between a holder device and a reader device where the data is authenticated and can be updated in real time. So it's far, far, far past just having a picture of your physical card on your phone. It's interactive encrypted data transmission. Also, the relying parties will not need to touch or take someone's device in order to be able to have that data transmitted to their reader device. So law enforcement at roadsides are going to be taking that. What are the use cases for MDL? It's the same use cases that we use our physical credential for today, with mobile driver license or with driver licenses being most commonly used form of ID. So road stops for law enforcement, age verification for age-restricted items, driver license to banks and financial institutions to pick up prescriptions, going through airports and security checkpoints. Of course, this list is not exhaustive, but it just gives you some good examples of really being able to understand that you'll use your mobile driver license everywhere you use your regular driver license or ID card today. Next slide, please. So what are some of the functional requirements that went into developing the standards for this work? It's really important to note that the standards were developed with privacy and security by design for the solution. Some other things that are very important to note is that the mobile driver license allows the user to, with the reader, to confirm the holder's identity, just as you do today with the physical card. It allows them to convey their driving privileges, just like they do today with their physical card. The mobile driver license must be trustable, meaning that the relying party has faith that the information is secure and accurate, has not been tampered with. One of the more important facts is that the solution must be interoperable. It doesn't do much good to develop a solution that's only good within restricted boundaries, whether that's state lines or what have you. Interoperable solution would allow someone to use their mobile driver license across state lines and even across country lines. So it's very important, especially as a part of the user experience, that mobile driver license can be used wherever they go. The selective information release we've already touched on a little bit. It allows the holder to actually select the data elements that they want to share with the relying party that are necessary for that transaction. So no more showing your physical card and everything that's on it. If the person only needs your age, that's all that they're getting from you. The standards address both the attended and the unattended use case. So in other words, basically person to person in an online use case. Right now, the standards have been developed for the attended use case, and the committees are working on the standards for the unattended use case. Remote management is also possible from the issuing authority standpoint. So the issuing authority would have complete control to push updates of information from their system to the actual device for the MDL. So they could go as far as to remove driving privileges in the event it's necessary and they've been removed from the person. So that remote management will be capable from the issuing authority's perspective. And last but not least, the solution needs to be able to work offline, fully aware that there's not internet capabilities and online capabilities everywhere that a person might go. So the solution needed to be able to work in an offline environment so that that transmission of data can still occur. Next slide, please. So in these next couple slides, what we're going to do is just talk about the benefits of MDL. The easiest way to do that is kind of compare it to some of the challenges we have with the physical credential. It's important to note that in these next few slides, we'll be showing you some features and functionality that are not necessarily defined by the standards and are dependent on the issuing authority's particular design and processes. But we do anticipate and have faith in the fact that issuing authorities will put in as secure and trustable solutions as possible when implementing their solutions. Next slide. So the first one I'd like to cover is, today our physical credentials, they get lost or stolen all the time. And once that's done, we can't do anything about it than to turn and get back. With mobile driver license, you can't really lose it. Even if you were to misplace your phone or lose your phone, no one else is going to be able to access your mobile driver license from the phone, because there's going to be at a minimum a PIN code Stronger solutions obviously will have biometrics, whether that's facial recognition, fingerprint, or a combination of the above for the person to be able to, verify themselves before they're allowed to access that data. So the days of losing your identity and driver information from that card are gone. There's also that remote management we talked about. So the issuing authority can remove a mobile driver license from a lost or stolen device. You also have the capacity to provision your mobile driver license onto a new device without having to go into your DMVs or your issuing authorities. Next slide, please. So today with our physical cards, they don't hold true to time. They easily bend, snap, fade, become damaged. It happens all the time. This isn't really a problem with the mobile driver license. Even if you were to damage your phone, we're back at what we talked about on the slide before, the mobile driver license can easily be removed from a device and provisioned onto a new device. And also you can't damage the data that's stored on the secure container in the phone. And so really no way to damage MDL. We get past that challenge with physical credentials. Next slide, please. Another issue we have with physical credentials is just outdated data. Physical credentials basically a snapshot in time, whether that's your name or your address information, your driver privileges, those types of things. And so whatever was the case when that card was issued to you is what shows on that card throughout the duration of its issuance, whether that's 5 or 8 years. With mobile driver license, information can be updated in real time, meaning that the issuing authority can push those updates to the mobile driver license through the app, and then that's what would be shown to the relying party. So in the case of someone changes their address online, that information can be pushed through real time, and that would be information that you're sharing as your current address, not your old one. Also, there's the capacity of, as I spoke before, the issuing authority needing to remove someone's driving privileges. Say you had a DUI and you're suspended, they could actually just leave the identity part of your MDL for you to share, but remove the actual driver privilege part. So, you're not having proof of driving privileges to show when you're not authorized to be driving. So some good points there for benefits of MDL. One of the more important benefits, and we've already touched on it, but it's important enough to continue to touch on it, is the privacy protection. So again, with MDL, the holder has full control in deciding to share data with the relying party and what data they will determine to share. So they'll actually be able to select the data elements that they're willing to share with the relying party, and that's all the relying party is going to receive on their end. And that minimizes the data. So again, we don't have that case where the girl is showing her ID at the bar, bouncer scans it, and now he has her address. If you didn't need that information, you're definitely not going to be given that information, or they don't want to share it with you. So it's a huge, huge benefit of a mobile driver license. Next slide, please. Another large issue is the issue of a flash pass. Today with physical credentials, the majority of relying parties have to go on to determine that that is your credential, is the photo that's on it. And so that's the flash pass type of thing where they're just taking a quick glance at the person and taking a quick glance at the photo on the credential, trying to make a determination if it's in person. Further looking at security features on the credential itself to try to determine if it's a genuine credential or if it's fake. And there's not a lot of training and resources provided to most relying parties to do either of those things. And so with mobile driver license, we kind of get away from the flash pass because we talked before, the holder of the device is going to actually have to use, the PIN code or those biometric technologies to access their data and be able to share that with the relying party. And in doing so, especially with the data that's coming back encrypted, you're going to build that form of trust where the relying party is not going to have to be relying on the photo to determine if that information actually belongs to you. Next slide, please. And counterfeit. So today with physical credentials, counterfeiting is a huge problem. There are probably millions in rotation and they are very inexpensive. You can find them all over on the internet. The sites get thousands and thousands of views a day. And they're very, very convincing. The counterfeiters have figured out every way to make the products look as close to the actual products issued by the issuing authority as possible. So people are getting by on the daily with these counterfeit credentials for whatever those reasons are that they've gone ahead and purchased them. With mobile driver license, since we're talking about electronically transmitted and authenticated data using interoperable systems and public key distribution, we are going to significantly decrease the number of counterfeit products out there for identity and driving privileges. So very, very huge benefit of mobile driver licensing if the implementations are compliant with the standards. And that's it for me. My contact information is on the screen, and I think these will be shared with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mindy. That's great. Very interesting stuff there. I just wanted to quickly ask you, you referred to, how the relying parties will maybe come in not necessarily all online at the same time, or that it might be a little bit different in different places. But can you maybe talk for just a second about where relying parties are at? Are the motor vehicle agencies, or are police, or are services that check people's ages, are they ready to use these credentials?
Oh, that's a great question, and it definitely depends on the particular relying party and the jurisdiction that you're talking about. So some jurisdictions are a little bit closer in their journey. They've actually done different pilots and things like that, where they've been able to engage different relying parties within their communities, whether it's liquor stores, law enforcement, or banks, what have you, to be able to use those products as a part of the pilots. There's also a couple of jurisdictions that have non-compliant solutions, meaning that they have some type of a mobile solution, but it's only useful within their jurisdictions. And so through the use of those types of applications within those jurisdictions, they're obviously gaining that interest from the relying party community, even though at some point when the standards are available, they're going to have to update their solutions, and they know that, to be interoperable so that they can be used across state lines. There's also one jurisdiction that does have a self-reported status of a compliant solution, but given that there's not really, other jurisdictions or ways to be able to verify that right now, it is self-reported, but same thing going on there. So I think the more that the jurisdictions start coming on board, and I think we'll see that over the next couple of years after the ISO group is successful in publishing the first part of their standard, more jurisdictions are going to follow suit, because it really means a lot to them to have that final product and not build off of a draft. And so I think once that's out, more jurisdictions are going to start coming on board with their solutions and rolling out. And as demand increases for citizens wanting to use their mobile driver license solution, relying parties will start to jump on board and being able to accept them. So it's kind of a two-part solution. Issuing authorities don't want to issue something that the citizens can't use anywhere, but the relying parties don't want to implement the technologies and the education to accept something that isn't going to come across their desk very often. And so there's definitely several groups such as Secure Technology Alliance and other groups that are dealing with more of the industry and the relying parties, helping to build that awareness, educate relying parties that it's coming, and try to prepare for that. Also, as a part of jurisdiction implementations, like to take Florida, for instance, as a part of their implementation, they're heavily engaging certain parts of the relying party communities so that when it launches, there's at least a number of places that have committed to being able to accept those solutions. And so I think, as with anything that's new, it's just going to take some time. But as the demand increases on both sides, the relying parties are going to start to follow suit.
So we should expect to hear more and more announcements, kind of thing.
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, we're up against the clock, so I would like to move along and call on Justin Akura to tell us more about what ICAO is doing and its advanced work to make digital travel credentials a reality. Justin.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. So I've been invited to provide a presentation on some work that we're doing in the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, around a digital travel credential or a digital passport. It was mentioned a few times in the introductory remarks, so I'll go into some detail. So next slide, please. So in terms of an agenda, I've just got a three-part presentation. So before actually jumping into the digital travel credential, what I thought I would do was just kind of quickly review how biometrics factor into passports and passport issuance. then talk about the predominant passport we have in circulation, the e-passport, and then I'll close out with a description of the digital travel credential. Next slide, please. So biometrics are used a lot in passport issuance, and they are a crucial component of the document itself. So if we go back to sort of the basics of what we do with a biometric, I think we need to look at identity. And so identity, I mean, it's broadly recognized that identity is really just a combination of biographic and biometric attributes. So by extension, verifying or establishing identity should be a relatively straightforward process. It would be, I mean, just kind of verifying the identity attributes and then associating them to an individual. In the passport context, we understand that process to be a little more complex. Identity does evolve, it's linked to a community, and it can be assumed. So to offset some of the risks of changes to identity, ICAO's put together an identity management framework, which we refer to as the evidence of identity. It's comprised of three main pillars. The first is ensuring that the claimed identity is genuine. The second pillar is ensuring that the presenter links to that identity. And the third piece is that the presenter uses that claimed identity in the community. So as an organization, ICAO does promote this framework as a best practices in identity management. Now, next slide, please. So biometrics can play a crucial role in this process, particularly with components 2 and 3. So in the passport context, we may use biometrics to match an applicant to the claimed identity. We may use their biometrics to seek endorsement from the community. And we may also use biometrics to ensure that that identity is not being used by somebody else in the community. Now that matching process can be manual. So it could be us requiring passport applicants to have a guarantor sign the back of a photo, or it can be automated. So we may take something like our passport applicant's photo, run it up against our database to confirm that nobody else has that identity. Next slide, please. Now, the real benefit of applying a lot of rigor in the early stages of passport issuance is that once we've established that identity, that biometric can be confidently added to the passport. So now what we're doing is we're putting the traveler in a position to assert their identity with the trustworthy biometrically enabled token. Next slide, please. That token is the electronic passport or the e-passport. Now, this is the quickly becoming sort of the global norm. So at last count, we approximated that about 135 of ICAO's 192 member states were issuing e-passports. So it is quickly becoming the document that's being issued around the world. So what you'll see on this slide here is the global structure that passport issuers need to apply when they're issuing an e-passport. So we've got a common format for data. And the main purpose of doing that is to ensure that the documents are globally interoperable. So that image on the left-hand side is the exact structure that issuers need to apply when they do issue their documents. So I'll draw your attention to the two required data groups of that structure. So data group 1 is the biographic details of the holder. So things like name, date of birth, nationality, those are all inserted into data group 1. And then data group 2 holds the face of the travel document holder. So when we populate that structure, which is known as the logical data structure, we're then required to encrypt the data. So what we do is we use a public key infrastructure to encrypt the data, and the byproduct of that process is what we refer to as the secure document object, or the SOD. So the benefit of doing that is that once the document's inspected with the right tools, we can confirm whether or not there's some tampering and confirm that it's been issued by the name of the state that's printed on the front of the book. So the two concepts or ideas that I really wanted to highlight on this slide are the LDS, which is the common format, and then the secure document object to the side. Next slide, please. So when we set out to do this work as a global community, what we quickly realized is that information from the passport is used by a wide range of stakeholders, and they all perform slightly different functions. So from the early stages of travel, when a traveler may be applying for a visa, all the way through to when they're processed at the border, there's some element of that passport that's used to ensure that person's the right person and that they have the right to travel. So in essence, we really didn't want to lose any of the functionality of the book. So we kept that in mind. That served as the key guiding principle of some of the work that we did moving forward. So if I can move into the next slide, please. So this is where we got to with the digital travel credential. So at the highest level, a digital travel credential can be either a derivative of an existing e-passport, so we can extract the data, or it can be issued in parallel to or in replacement of a physical passport. Now, what we're putting in the DTC is that entire data structure, so the LDS and the SOD, so the encrypted data to confirm authenticity. So regardless of whether a document is issued or derived, it will contain the same information, and it includes the information that we feel is paramount to ensuring that a traveler can effectively cross a border. The last point on this slide is really about backwards compatibility. So we do recognize that there'll be some early adopters of this technology, particularly as most countries, 135 of those ICAO member states are actually effectively positioned to start doing this tomorrow. But we know that over time, this concept will evolve and there'll be a migration to some of those more advanced models where there'll be more issuance. But regardless of whether or not a country adopts this today or 10 years down the road, all those DTCs will be backwards compatible. And that's a really big important part for a global system when you're talking about change. It can't be big bang, it has to be incremental. So if I can go into the first slide, the first type here. So this slide actually describes the work that we've been doing over the past number of years, and it's what we're just rounding the corner on in terms of standardization. So we refer to this model as the Type 1 DTC, and what it is it's a digital copy of the information that's stored on the passport right now. So that information, so the LDS and the SOD that go into the passport and issuance are extracted from the book and they're put into a globally interoperable container. And that's the main difference from what's happening today at the border system, for instance, and what we're standardizing. So the container that holds the data is now globally interoperable. And the real benefit of doing that is that the data has been separated from the physical token. So it can move in advance of the traveler. So if you're thinking about like a typical trip where you would check into a flight, you'd provide your passport details. What we envision here is that the traveler could potentially provide their DTC rather than manually type the information in. And because the DTC includes that encryption piece, so the byproduct of our encryption, it can be authenticated. So the data can be used. And that's a really, really big, important part for our storyline, is that the data itself is really just, it's new data. So it does need to be authenticated before it can be used. So before you can trust the biometric, that authentication process is essential. So at the moment with an e-passport, the system that we use to do that is known as the ICAO Public Key Directory. And that's a global repository of certificates that come out of that encryption process. So every member of the PKD will upload information to the repository, and their passports can be authenticated around the world. So we're just, in terms of timelines for this, we're actually finalizing the specifications, and they've gone through an international endorsement process, which was just wrapping up last week. We do have a few things to finalize before this will become operational, but as of today, I would expect that the DTC is almost operational. So next slide, please. So this slide describes what, it starts to describe what we're going to be working on in the next couple months, I would say years. And this is what we refer to as the Type 2 DTC. So in this model, what happens is the issuing authority, the passport issuer, would provide the traveler with both a physical book and then a digital travel credential. Now, those two tokens would be distinct, and they could be used differently from travel. Now, the main difference between the Type 1 DTC and Type 2 DTC is that the issuing authority signs over the digital container. So that the purpose of doing that is that if a traveler has their DTC stored on their phone and they don't have a book with them, the the inspecting agent can say, I need to confirm that that DTC came from you. So then the traveler can pull out their phone. It can be queried to confirm that there's a container that sits there that owns that data. So that's the main difference. And it's really, I mean, this is starting to look into the medium term when there's more comfortability around using just data in place of a physical token. But there is a real possibility that a traveler may attempt to just move around with just that DTC. And I don't think the global community is there just yet. In type 1, what I should have mentioned was the fallback mechanism for that is really the book. So if the border agent says, I want to confirm that that data came from you, the traveler can pull out their book and it has the same information as the DTC. And they can say it came from this book. So then the border guard can leaf through the book, look at things like travel history and all of that. So next slide, please. So this slide describes the type 3 DTC. And it's quite similar. It's identical to the type 2 DTC, but the implementation model is different. So in this case, the issuing authority isn't providing a physical book at all. They're just providing the traveler with the DTC. And as I mentioned, I think this is something that is a couple years out. And it's, the community has to be ready to accept something like this. So last slide, please. So just to close out, what I wanted to do was just kind of give speak to a use case, the DTC type 1. So this is a graphic that we've pulled together in the context of kind of exploring what the DTC might look like in practice. So in this model, the traveler is either checking in from home or they're checking in at the airport. But what they do is they take their physical passport and they hold it up against their smartphone, or they put it down on a kiosk, and the information is extracted from the passport and it's put into that DTC container. Now the data becomes mobile. In this model, we see the DTC being bounced off the PKD, or the certificate stored in the PKD. And that process, I can't answer any questions on that. It's not as simple as just bouncing it off. But what we've done there is we've authenticated the data. So now we know the data can be trusted, particularly the biometric. And then from there, the DTC would be populated into a cloud that would be accessible by governments and air industry. Now, as the traveler flows through, and speaking to the bottom half of the slide here, they would move through a number of the controlled checkpoints just using their face. So they may drop their bag, they may go through the boarding gate, they may go through security, and then they may eventually be processed at the receiving border with just their face. Now, in order for that to happen, there would have to be some sort of arrangement, or the cloud would have to be accessible by the receiving country. But that's the real benefit of the DTC, is that it can travel. So then from a traveler perspective, you're really just walking through all these processes. You're not pulling out your passport. You may need to pull out your boarding pass depending on what the airport environment looks like. And then you clear the process from end to end. In this model, we see the DTC disappearing for privacy and security reasons. But that's just a flavor of what it could all look like. So with that, I'll just close out.
Thanks very much, Justin. So one thing I want to ask you, just to go into a little bit more detail on, is I think a lot of people have heard of, whether it's biometric exit or simplified arrival in the US, or overseas in a place like India, they have DigiYatra. These systems utilize some sort of similar concepts, but I think what you're talking about, it seems like it's going a step further, right? It's not really an extension of that kind of idea. It's something more, right? Can you flesh that out a bit?
Yeah, and I think those are really good models to build from in terms of a concept, but they are really just, they're models that are unique to a particular airport environment. So they do rely on things like a back to source check. So the traveler may provide their identity information, then the government may confirm it and provide a biometric, for instance. In this model, what we're really talking about is the token itself, right? So the token it has a real potential of connecting those facilitative schemes. So you could leave, the United States with, moving through their biometric and entry-exit program, and then provided that the DTC is sent over to India, you could then continue that process. So you don't have to restart. And that's IKEO works that principle of global interoperability. And I did try to highlight that as much as possible, but because the container does lean on international specifications and standardization, once it hits the receiving country, then it can be readable, and that's the real benefit of what we're talking about here is a globally interoperable piece.
Perfect, that global interoperability, great. So we are running quite short on time. We've had a number of interesting questions from the audience, and I'd just like to just address a couple of them really quickly, and then throw them or possibly another question out for the panel. We've had a question: what happens when you get a new phone? How do you get your MDL again? And my impression is that it would be sort of operate as an app kind of thing. You could download it and then authenticate. Am I on the right track there, Mindy? Yeah. So that's there's another one similarly. There was a question about what happens when you get a new phone. How do you get that? Sorry, let's see. Was that one? A couple of really interesting questions here. We're not going to have time to get to them all, unfortunately. But I would actually like to just quickly read a question that was asked to the panelists. Do you ever foresee mobile digital credentials that are rooted in anything other than a physical credential? Now, Justin got a bit into this with the different versions. It's not totally separate, but issued as two different credentials anyways. But do you envision a future where we can apply for a digital only product from a state DMV or from the State Department? And how would that work, or why not? Who would like to jump in there first? Jean-Baptiste, please.
Yeah, if you don't mind. So first of all, the limitation to go for a digital only world would be the last person that is not able to read it. And you always need to find a way that your identity credential allows you to make use of it wherever you are. And if there is one remaining person who cannot read your mobile or your digital credential, then you will have to have your physical credential.
Anyone else want to follow up on that?
If I can add a piece in there. So the reason why we had sort of a type or three type introduction model is really because, as I mentioned, we are introducing some innovation into the way we do things now. But because anything we do has such a wide impact, we really needed to phase it in. So the type 1 model is something that could be operationalized almost tomorrow. And there is always a fallback switch. But the intent of type 1 really is, to resolve some immediate pressures on the system now, but also to introduce some change and to be a bit of a catalyst for us to have stakeholders comfortable just using digital information as opposed to a physical token. So until we get that shift, I think we're stuck in sort of a hybrid model at the moment. But this, from our perspective, this is a bit of a game changer. It should get airports, airlines, and border control used to just using data in place of a book.
That hybrid is a step forward, right, from the previous. It's just a step along the journey. So I think we're well over the hour. I just want to ask one more question to the panel. Another good question from the audience, which is, do we ever foresee these kind of credentials being used outside of the normal use cases that we normally associate with passports and driver's licenses? Can they serve a valuable function in different kinds of transactions or elections, where was also mentioned in the question? Anyone want to jump in on that?
Sure, I'll take a shot at that. So absolutely, the places that are using, or the functions that are using digital credentials today, or are using physical credentials to, say, authenticate to a website, open a bank account, process a loan, all of these things where identity is important, but you can't necessarily go in and meet with someone because of the current environment we're in. Yeah, a digital credential that is authenticatable could easily take the place of that physical credential. Now, elections is a whole different thing, simply because most states don't want to do IDs anyways, much less digital IDs. But yeah, that's a completely different topic. But yes, there are plenty of places where you're going in and you're maybe renting a car, or you're doing a car sharing application. You want to make sure of the identity of the driver before you get in, and the driver wants to make sure that you're a good guy as well. Those types of things. There's all sorts of different uses for digital credentials that are being reviewed and starting to be implemented today.
Chris, if you authorize me to have an additional consideration on that we have not covered so much today, is the fact that a mobile identity needs to have a legal value. If a mobile identity doesn't have a legal value, it's a toy, right? And that's not what we're talking about today. Here, we're talking about identity that are issued by authorized party governments, and the legal value of the mobile identity makes that you can have all these various use cases around. Everyone will recognize it because it is legally enforceable. And that's a very important aspect of a mobile identity where biometrics play a major role.
Having that trust that goes straight from the government issuance straight to enabling the relying party to do what they need to do. Makes perfect sense. Well, thank you all very much for these great presentations. It's been very interesting for me, and thank you very much to everyone who participated with questions in the chat and everything. I think questions about recordings are about to be answered as well. So with that, I will thank you all and throw it over to Tova. Just hit your mute there, Tova.
Is this better? Thank you. Well, thank you, Chris, for handling this very illuminating seminar. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of it to me was the discussion about the practical implications of trying to go from what we have to something very, very different. And I thought that was a very illuminating part. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I know I'm ready to go get my mobile driver's license, and hope that many of you feel the same way. I want to thank all our speakers and our moderator for sharing their expertise with us, and also to express how great appreciation to Acuant, our sponsor, and to our media partner, biometricupdate.com. We will have a webinar recording available by the end of the week. It will all depend upon how much editing or other little things that we have to do, but we will send out a notice to let you know that it is up and where you can find it. And you're always welcome to check us out at ibia.org. And you can also find us on Facebook and LinkedIn, so we can continue this important conversation, which is certainly not going away soon at all. But thank you very much.